When Melissa Carter first moved into her dream home in Hillsborough County, Florida, she believed she had finally found peace. The small two-story house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by palm trees and manicured lawns. It wasn't a mansion, but it was hers, a place where her two young kids could play in the sprinklers, ride their bikes, and build the kind of childhood memories she never had. The neighborhood was governed by an HOA, but Melissa didn't mind. She'd heard stories, sure, but she assumed that as long as she followed the rules, she'd be fine. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. She kept her yard trimmed, her mailbox painted white like everyone else's, and even attended the HOA's spring cookout. But behind the friendly smiles and "welcome to the neighborhood" greetings, there were watchers, neighbors who took the HOA rulebook as gospel and saw every deviation as a personal affront. Among them was a woman named Sandra Hughes, the HOA's compliance officer and self-appointed enforcer of order. Sandra lived 3 houses down and spent her days walking the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, inspecting lawns, driveways, and fences like a private investigator for suburban perfection. The trouble began during Florida's dry season. A patch of Melissa's lawn, despite her best efforts, turned brown. It wasn't neglect. She had adjusted her watering schedule in line with the county's drought restrictions. But to Sandra, that didn't matter. Within a week, Melissa received her first courtesy notice taped to her front door. It was neatly printed, framed with the HOA's logo, and stated that her lawn's appearance did not meet community aesthetic standards. The notice gave her 10 days to restore full lawn health or face fines. Melissa tried her best. She fertilized, reseeded, and watered within legal limits. But grass doesn't grow overnight, and Sandra didn't care about weather or water restrictions. 2 weeks later came another letter, this time labeled Official Violation Notice. It came with a fine of $150. The tone was cold, impersonal, and final. To Sandra and the HOA board, this was not about grass. It was about control. Things escalated quickly after that. The next month, Sandra took issue with Melissa's mailbox. A small patch of mildew had formed on its base after a week of rain. The notice described it as unsightly and demanded immediate cleaning or replacement. Melissa wiped it down that same day, but another violation arrived a week later, this time for failure to maintain mailbox to community standards. She couldn't understand how anyone could find joy in policing a mailbox, but in this neighborhood, appearances were power. Then came the van. Melissa's ex-husband was a mechanic who sometimes visited to drop off tools or check on the kids. His work van, clean but clearly marked with his business logo, parked in her driveway on weekends. It wasn't permanent, but it was enough to draw Sandra's attention once again. The HOA rules prohibited commercial vehicles in visible driveways. Melissa tried to explain that it wasn't hers, that it wasn't there overnight, but her words meant nothing. A new violation appeared, and the fines began stacking faster than she could pay. The letters became more aggressive. Each envelope had the same bold heading: immediate action required. The language shifted from polite to threatening, warnings of liens, court fees, and legal action. Melissa felt trapped. She was a single mother juggling 2 jobs, already behind on utilities, and now staring down hundreds of dollars in HOA penalties. She tried attending the next HOA board meeting to plead her case, but when she arrived, the members sat behind a long folding table, speaking in monotone, eyes down, voices firm. They told her the fine stood. There would be no exceptions. Rules were rules. Weeks passed, and life only grew harder. The stress of constant notices and late-night worry began to take its toll. Melissa started to dread walking to her mailbox. Every envelope felt like a new punishment. She stopped watering her lawn altogether, unable to afford the extra utility costs. The once green grass faded to a patchwork of yellow and brown, a visible mark of defiance or defeat, depending on who was looking. To Sandra, it was proof that Melissa didn't belong there. Then came the letter that would change everything. It was longer than the usual notices, printed on thicker paper, stamped with legal insignia. It stated that due to unpaid fines and continued noncompliance, the HOA had filed a complaint in county court. Melissa barely understood the language: petition for enforcement, civil infraction, failure to comply. She had no lawyer, no experience, and no idea what to do next. The date of the hearing was buried in the middle of the page, listed in small print. Overwhelmed, she placed the letter on the kitchen counter, intending to read it again later when the kids were asleep. But between long shifts and school drop-offs, days turned into weeks. The notice sat under a pile of unpaid bills and school forms, forgotten in the chaos of survival. When the court date came and went, Melissa wasn't there. She never saw the order that followed, the one authorizing the county to issue a bench warrant for her failure to appear. That night, she sat in her living room, exhausted, unaware that the next chapter of her life had already been written without her. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the palm trees swaying in the humid breeze. A single porch light flickered on across the street, Sandra's house. Inside, Sandra was likely filling out her next compliance report, satisfied that she had once again upheld the sanctity of their perfect little community. But perfection has a cost. And soon, the cost would come due, because in less than a week, the HOA's obsession with control would cross a line no one in that neighborhood had ever imagined. And Melissa Carter, the woman with the brown grass and the dirty mailbox, would find herself standing in handcuffs on her own front lawn. The morning of the arrest began like any other. The Florida sun crept slowly over the cul-de-sac, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Sprinklers hissed rhythmically, misting the sidewalks as if the neighborhood itself was being purified of imperfection. Birds called softly in the distance, and for a brief moment, everything seemed calm. Inside her home, Melissa Carter was packing lunches for her 2 kids, still half asleep and running late for school. She didn't know that, just a few blocks away, a sheriff's deputy was being briefed on a warrant with her name on it. The warrant was simple, a civil contempt order stemming from her failure to appear in court. But in the sterile language of bureaucracy, it sounded grave. Subject failed to comply with court order issued by Hillsborough County Civil Division. Case hashtag 14572B. To the deputy, it was just another box to check before lunch. To Melissa, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. At 8:14 a.m., a white county patrol SUV rolled quietly down the street. Curtains twitched. Garage doors paused mid-open as curious eyes peeked out. The officer parked in front of Melissa's home and stepped out, papers in hand. The badge on his uniform caught the morning light, bright, impersonal, official. He knocked on the door. When Melissa opened it, confusion flashed across her face. There was no scene, no yelling, no resistance. Just disbelief. She listened as the deputy explained something about a missed court date, about an order she never saw. Her children stood behind her, clutching their backpacks, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the tension. The deputy asked her to step outside. Neighbors began to gather, a few at first, then more. Sandra Hughes was among the first to emerge, holding a cup of coffee, watching from her porch. Her eyes were fixed on the scene like a spectator at a play she had helped write. The deputy gently turned Melissa around, cuffed her hands behind her back, and began leading her toward the patrol car. The sound of metal closing echoed faintly against the stucco walls of the houses. The children cried, and one of the neighbors, a kind woman named Rosa, came running to comfort them. Melissa tried to speak, but her voice cracked beneath the weight of humiliation and fear. The officer assured her that she would be booked, processed, and likely released later that day. But those words didn't register. All she could think about was how something as small as a patch of brown grass had spiraled into this, by mid-morning. Photos of the arrest had already begun to circulate in the neighborhood's private Facebook group. The captions varied. "Some people just don't follow the rules," one post read. "This is why the HOA exists," said another. But among the predictable comments of compliance and superiority, there were a few dissenting voices. People who had lived quietly under the HOA's thumb, paying fines they couldn't afford, now began to ask questions. How did it get this far? Can they really arrest someone over grass? Melissa spent nearly 7 hours in custody. The holding cell was cold, fluorescent, and loud, filled with the sounds of shuffling feet, clanking metal, and the low murmur of other inmates. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother, a neighbor, a woman who had simply missed a court notice buried under piles of HOA paperwork. Her mugshot was taken, her fingerprints scanned, and her dignity stripped in the process. When she was finally released on a small bond, her name was already trending in local Facebook groups and online neighborhood forums. She returned home that evening with red eyes and trembling hands. Her children ran to her, crying with relief, but the shame lingered. A paper notice had been taped to her door during her absence, a new violation. Trash cans visible from the street. The irony stung like salt on a wound. Over the next few days, the story began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Someone had sent the photos to a local news station, and soon, Melissa's face appeared on the evening broadcast. The headline was blunt: Florida mom arrested over HOA dispute. The news anchor's tone was measured, but the story ignited a wildfire of outrage online. People across the county, and then across the state, began to share it. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some were sympathetic, calling it an abuse of power. Others, predictably, sided with the HOA, insisting that rules are rules. Sandra Hughes watched the coverage from her living room that night, her expression tight and unreadable. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She had simply enforced the regulations everyone had agreed to. But somewhere deep inside, she could feel the faint stirrings of unease. The camera crews that had shown up the next morning weren't there for her approval. They were there to ask questions the HOA board wasn't ready to answer. Meanwhile, Melissa found herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. Reporters knocked on her door. Activists reached out offering legal help. Even neighbors who had once kept their distance now came forward to share their own horror stories of fines, threats, and bullying from the board. The illusion of a perfect neighborhood began to crumble. What had once been a symbol of order now looked like a machine of quiet cruelty, grinding down anyone who dared to fall behind. In the days that followed, Melissa began gathering every notice, every letter, every photo. She placed them in a binder, evidence of how far things had gone. With the help of a local attorney who offered pro bono support, she began to piece together a case of harassment and procedural abuse. The court documents revealed a chilling pattern. Dozens of minor citations turned into escalating fines, then into legal complaints filed with minimal oversight. It wasn't just her. Others had been threatened with liens, foreclosure, even eviction over trivial violations. The community began to fracture. Board meetings once sparsely attended were now overflowing. Residents demanded answers, and the HOA president stumbled through carefully worded statements about policy enforcement and community integrity. But the tide was turning. The viral video of Melissa's arrest, shaky phone footage showing her in handcuffs on her front lawn, had reached millions of views online. Commentators called it a symbol of HOA tyranny. News outlets from other states picked up the story. Even a state representative tweeted about the need for HOA accountability. For Melissa, it was surreal. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She only wanted her life back, her home, her peace, her dignity. But sometimes, it takes one person's breaking point to expose a system built on intimidation. As the sun set on the 7th day since her arrest, she stood on her porch, looking at her yard, the same patch of brown grass that had started it all. It looked no different than it had before, but now, to her, it symbolized something entirely new: resistance. The sprinkler heads glimmered under the twilight sky, silent but waiting. Tomorrow, she decided, she would water the grass again. But this time, not for the HOA. This time, she would do it for herself. The days that followed Melissa Carter's arrest marked a turning point, not only for her, but for the entire neighborhood. The quiet, polished streets of the Hillsborough Lakes community were no longer calm. Camera vans now lined the curbs, reporters staked out near the community sign, and residents whispered in driveways about the woman who got arrested for grass. What was once a pristine, rule-bound neighborhood now felt like the scene of a reckoning. The HOA board scrambled to regain control. They issued statements filled with legal jargon, trying to distance themselves from the arrest. They claimed the issue was a matter of compliance, not cruelty. But the damage was done. The video of Melissa standing in handcuffs on her front lawn had already burned its way into public consciousness. Comment sections overflowed with outrage. News anchors debated the role of HOAs in suburban life. And neighbors who once feared speaking out began to step forward, one by one, with their own stories of overreach and intimidation. Melissa tried to stay quiet at first. She was still processing what had happened: the humiliation, the fear, the sudden attention. Her attorney advised her to stay off social media, but the messages poured in anyway. Some were hateful, accusing her of laziness or exaggeration. But most were compassionate, people who had suffered similar treatment under overzealous associations. Strangers mailed her handwritten letters, telling her she wasn't alone. Others sent donations to help cover her legal costs. For the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't powerless. Still, every day brought reminders of the nightmare. Her mailbox, the same one that had sparked one of her earliest finds, became a symbol of everything she'd endured. She thought about painting it gold, not out of vanity, but as a quiet act of defiance. But she didn't. Instead, she left it exactly as it was, plain, slightly faded, but standing strong. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. Normally, only a handful of residents showed up, but this time, the room overflowed. Chairs lined the back wall, and people stood shoulder to shoulder, holding printouts of news articles and screenshots of violation notices. The air buzzed with tension and the low hum of whispered conversations. Melissa arrived quietly, wearing a plain blue blouse and carrying her binder of evidence. As she took a seat near the front, all eyes turned toward her. The board members sat stiffly behind their folding table, papers stacked neatly, microphones adjusted, faces pale. Sandra Hughes sat among them, her usual composure cracking at the edges. The meeting began with the president reading a prepared statement about miscommunication and unfortunate escalation. But before he could finish, a voice from the back interrupted. "Unfortunate," someone repeated. "You had her arrested."